Movies about World War II were often filled with heroic stories of young men on the ground or at sea, or in this case, the movie we're going to talk about today, Memphis Belle, in the air. Bomber crews performing their duties over Nazi-occupied Europe in this case, trying desperately to get home. And that's what this film in 1991 chronicles. But that's not the only story of World War II, especially when we talk about the Air Force. And in fact, I think a lot of us are familiar with the roles that women played in World War II when it comes to their roles as nurses or as actually the people who built these planes. I think we're all familiar with Rosie the Riveter. But something I wasn't familiar with was this thing called the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, called the WASPs, which is actually the single most difficult word for me to be able to say. And I wasn't even familiar with them until I got to talking to my friend Sarah Myers, who is actually our guest today. And she just created this book, wrote this book that I just got from UNC Press a few weeks ago called Earning Their Wings, The Wasps of World War II and the Fight for Veteran Recognition. And what's fascinating about Sarah is that she is like, in my mind, just the performing the purest form of history. She actually got a chance to track down these women who generations earlier performed these roles in World War II and talk to them and record their oral histories about what they did during the war. These amazing women pilots who I had never even heard of. And then she writes this amazing, just fabulous book that's out this week. So today we're going to talk about Memphis Belle. We're going to talk about her work as a professor at Messiah University up in Pennsylvania. And I hope you guys really dig the podcast. The only small little caveat is this was actually the very first pod I did after I moved here to Colorado. I could not find my primary microphone, so I'm using my travel mic, and my audio sounds a little odd. So if you will, please do forgive that. Fortunately, I don't get a chance to talk very much because Sarah is absolutely freaking brilliant, and she has so much to say about this. So I hope you dig the pod today. It was an awesome conversation to sit down and talk to Sarah about this. So sit back and relax because Memphis Belle is next on Historians of Movies podcast. Hey, Sarah Myers, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing really good. I am in the throes of preparing for the semester, so we're starting next week.
Oh my gosh, that's right. You're like a historian, which is good considering the nature of this podcast. So where are you professing and what are you going to profess this semester?
Let's see. I am professing in central Pennsylvania. It's a small school called Messiah University, and I teach U.S. history, 1865 to the present, women's history, public history. It's a small university, so I kind of wear a lot of hats.
We're recording this at 8:39 on a Thursday. It's late where you are.
It is.
Like, now that I'm in Mountain Times, I still have to cook dinner after we get through talking. So let's talk for 12 minutes. We'll make this a flyby podcast. So in line with the WASP.
No pun intended. Yeah.
1,000% pun intended. We talk. Okay. So you teach 1865 to present. What else do you teach over there? You teach more than one class.
Yeah. So I teach like women's history. I teach museums, monuments, memorials, which is a really fun class. I really like that class. I also teach a War, Peace, and Memory in U.S. history class too. That's my other favorite class.
Well, that's perfect considering your line of work and your book and things like that we're going to talk about. I wonder what it's like in Pennsylvania because, growing up in Kentucky, we have all these monuments and things like that to the Civil War, only they're for the bad guys. What's it like running around like a place like Pennsylvania and there's monuments to the North, or I guess the federal government is what we would say now, America?
Well, so when I first came, I was excited because I was like, oh, yay, Gettysburg, this will be fun. But there are actually still a lot of people who support the Confederacy, even though we are in the quote unquote North. And so like when they have the anniversary every summer, I've actually never been to one of them. I've just heard stories. I've heard that it's sort of like mingling of all of the people at these things, not just people who want to actually learn, but people who want to like quote unquote educate, right, about different aspects, even though, it's all very confusing and contradictory, and it's fine. But for the most part, my students are shocked to know how I learned about the Civil War, because I grew up in Missouri, and I learned that it was the War of Northern Aggression, and about slavery and all these narratives. And my students are like, what? Because my students come from like PA, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, and they're very confused by that. So
what I'm confused about is you just referred to the Keystone State as PA. Is that a common? Have you normalized into the land of Penn's Woods? Do they really call it PA over there?
They do. So I think they have acclimated a little bit, because I also pronounce the town. We used to call it Lancaster when I grew up in Missouri, but here they call it Lancaster. And I noticed the other day that I pronounced it correctly. So I think I've become a Pennsylvanian now or something.
Right. Well, you've come a long way from MO, I think.
Nobody does this for the other states. That's what I was telling them when I first moved here. I was like, no one else says the letters of their,
No, and like every state has its weird, funky things. Like in Kentucky, we've got this town called Versailles, which is Versailles.
Same in Missouri. Right? Same in Missouri, yeah.
Totally. And if anyone listening has ever been to Kansas, first of all, I'm sorry. But also, actually, that was a jab at our producer, Fletcher. Hey, Fletcher. But then also, like, every word, starting first and foremost with the river that flows through Wichita, which is the Arkansas River. Only, do you know how they pronounce it in Kansas? Think about it for a second. They call it the Arkansas River. It's painfully delightful, the locals. If my Wichita friends are listening, they're no longer my Wichita friends, because they are very serious about this. All right. Very important question. Now that you're in PA, Coke or Pepsi, what do you got?
I just normally say soda, but I like Coke better.
Okay. We can continue. All right. That's good. And for our candy listeners who are might be keying in on this, I am adapting to life. Now, this is the first podcast we've done since I've moved to Pueblo. So I'm not drinking a Coke or Pepsi, but instead a Walter's Blood Orange Lager, which is what the locals here in Colorado survive on, is beer. So, and you're drinking tea, right?
I am, in a suffrage mug that my friend got me, because we have to add some element of history to this.
We'll get to the history at the very, very end of this whole thing. Is this like sweet tea? Is this hot tea? What is this?
No, it's hot tea, because I don't know. It's not like super cold outside or anything, but it's starting to feel like fall at night. So it actually is okay for hot tea right now.
I drink hot tea on a plane. That's like my jam to like calm down when I'm driving. When I'm flying on a plane, people are like, the attendants are like, "What would you like?" I'm like, "A hot tea," because I'm slowly turning into my great grandmother. Okay, so I've been wanting to do this because you've got a great new book coming out, and we're totally going to talk about this book today. And we're trying to figure out a film to tie this into, except for I was realizing there's not movies about women in World War II. There's what, A League of Their Own?
Yes.
Crickets. And that's it?
Crickets.
Is that what we got?
I mean, there's like a random TV show that was about Canadian women that worked in factories during World War II. I forget the name of it in this very moment, but it was a TV show, and it was like an HBO short series.
What did Canada contribute to the war effort? Were we low on maple syrup as we fought the Nazis? What happened?
They literally were producing, guns and tanks and planes, just like we were.
No, yeah, I do not believe this. In Canada, they're so polite over there. I thought they would be producing brooms and oh, hey, we'll help you clean up here after the bombing. Some axes, perhaps, to chop down the woods or something. I don't know. Really?
I mean, they helped us do some illegal shit during the war, because they had FDR before we, declared war, because of the Lend-Lease Act and, Neutrality Acts and all this stuff. We would have planes that we put at the border, and we would push them across, right? So Canadians did nefarious things,
We should talk about Lend-Lease Act. So one of the things I want to talk to you about today, obviously we're talking about this film Memphis Belle, right, which comes out, I think, in 1990, about this famed B-17 bomber. And this is a man movie, which is in a lot of ways a stark contrast, I think, to your book that's just about to come out. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about what we see on screen, and then what's really going on behind the scenes to get this American fighting force that's fighting maybe overseas. But one of the things you really illustrate in the book is how women are playing this really integral role in fighting. And I think sometimes we think about women's roles, or at least me, before I started reading your stuff, was thinking about, okay, I think I know about Rosie the Riveter. I know about Madonna because I saw League of Their Own, but that was about it. So I knew riveting and baseball, but I didn't know there was like this whole flying corps of women in the skies utterly kicking ass. So I want to get actually. You know what? Let's talk about your book first and foremost. Like you talked about. Tell me about your book, which is through UNC Press, right?
Yeah, and it's called Earning Their Wings. I'm very excited about it. Yeah, it talks about the story of these women pilots during World War II, and it situates them in the context. So we talk about the ways that women, I said we, but I mean me. I don't know why I just did that. But they were inspired by early barnstormers that were like Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, those kind of era of pilots. So they would be inspired by them. Or there were some of my women pilots that were actually old enough they were in the original barnstormers. They flew in the 20s in air shows and entertained and things like that. And then during World War II, we have this like women's pilot program where women actually get to fly for the military. So you have like all these women pilots that descend into Texas and get military training and then are stationed across the US. And they do really crazy things. Like they do what male pilots did, but they're the only branch of the military where women are doing things that are not traditional for women in any way. The other branches, like 90 to 95% of the work that women are doing for like the Army or the Navy or Marine Corps is all, considered to be traditional. It's like communications work or nursing or things like that. For the WASP, no, they're flying planes and they're learning how to take apart engines and they're learning physics and all these things. And so they are, doing things like flying planes that have been created by Rosie the Riveters and taking them from factories to bases so they can go overseas. Or my favorite example, because it's just so crazy, is that they towed targets. So there would be targets hooked to cables by the back of the plane, and they would literally have men on the ground practice shooting anti-aircraft artillery guns at these targets with live ammunition. And then they would, aim for the targets that the women were carrying on the backs of their planes, which is just really crazy.
That's some crazy ass dangerous shit.
Yes.
Like, how did you come to this project? And also, you mentioned WASP earlier. What does WASP stand for?
WASP is Women Air Force Service Pilots. It's a very unfortunate acronym because obviously it has other connotations, but I couldn't find any like resources or records that show that the Army Air Force during World War II in any way had conversations about this or was aware of it.
They weren't like a bunch of flying Baptists.
There are a bunch of like common acronyms. It was like a common practice for women pilot, like for the women's units. So women in the Army Corps were the WACs, and women in the Coast Guard were the SPARs, and women in the Navy were very unfortunately named the Waves because we have to be really punny about everything, except for the Marines. Because the general of the Marines said, no, they're Marines. They are not getting a nickname. And so they were just called Women Marines.
That sounds like the most Marine thing I've heard.
Yes, because they're really, really, working on their culture during World War II. And so I feel like that's a great example of that.
All right. So when does this WASP program begin? Like, when does it start to kick in?
It begins in 1942 and it ends in 1944. So we're talking like several months after the war starts in 1941, you have this pilot program starting, and then it ends in December 1944, which is like 8 months before the war ends in 1945. So it's for the middle of the war, basically, for the U.S. involvement anyway.
Well, it's kind of perfect because it overlaps with the sequences of the film during Memphis Belle, right? Which I think Memphis Belle is taking place in 43. It's the story of this B-17 bomber crew. They're on their 24th run. And they're about to go make the 25th run, because once you get done with that 25th run, you get to come home. And of course, it's the one that almost kills them all. So first and foremost, we watched this film. I watched it last night. You watched it a couple nights ago. What are your thoughts on Memphis Belle? Had you seen this film before?
I had seen it first in high school because I had a high school history teacher who was obsessed with aviation. So he had us watch like anything aviation related, and then, which probably had an influence on me subconsciously in some way. And then, that's how these things work. And then I watched it again when I was preparing a World War II class to teach World War II for the first time for undergrads, because I wanted them to do like a movie review, I got the idea from some other historians on Twitter, and I was like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I should do that. And so I just watched like every World War II movie I could think of again to see if it was worthy or not to put on this list. And then I watched it again for this. So 3 times.
I came to this movie. I remember watching it when I was younger, thinking, "Oh man, this movie was awesome." And then I watched it last night and did not feel as awesome about this movie. Like, what were you thinking as you were watching it Tuesday night?
So I thought what this movie is really good for, it's not for historical accuracy. They do not even try to get the details right. But what they do get right is they give situations that could potentially happen and did happen for bombing crews. So I felt like it was a good little like snapshot of what is it like to be in a bombing crew or a pilot for B-17, like a bomber plane, and then how, what does that look like for you in terms of like your interactions with your commanding officers or with people back home? Like, I thought they did good with that. So I actually came up with like a lot of things that I was like, oh, you're doing great showing, what it's even like being inside a bomber at high altitudes, right? And things like that.
I remember like growing up, like we would watch these movies and I would think, "Oh man, I would never want to be on the ground in World War II. I would never want to be infantry." But the mortality rates for these bomber crews are just outrageous. I mean, chances are these dudes are not coming home, right?
Yeah, so actually in the era of the Memphis Belle, which was 1943, like you said earlier, it was about 1 in 5 bombing crews made it. And that's considering just the chances of completing 25 missions. So, like if you're looking at like how many people died, like not thinking about completing 25 missions, I think it was something like during that year, I think it was like 2 and 3 people were dying, to men, because there's just like a high mortality rate because if you notice, okay, so the really famous World War II movie besides like, I don't know, something terrible like Pearl Harbor is I think like Red Tails, the movie about like the Tuskegee Airmen who flew like pursuit aircraft to protect bombers, which is a very terribly made movie. There's a lot of
Oh
problems with
my
that.
god.
But
Were you there the night we did that on HATM? Did you twiddle on that night?
I
We
did
did that
it.
movie.
I
It's the
know.
worst movie I've ever
Yeah,
seen. It's so
it's devastating.
impossibly awful. Oh my god. Can we talk about Red Tails for a second? That movie felt like it was just a bunch of clips put together for trailers, all assembled. It was awful. It was like the single worst movie. I apologized to the crowd after we watched it. After
Oh.
2 hours of wanting to jab a fork into my eyeballs and also my ears, it was just awful. Okay, anyway, if we're coming back, did you see the Tuskegee Airmen's film that was on HBO years ago with like Lawrence Fishburne?
Oh, yes, I have. Yeah.
That one was better. It
Yes,
was
it is
better in
better.
that I didn't want to die after watching it.
Yes, and they actually addressed issues of race in that one, right? Like the other one is like really botched job of
It was
yeah.
just a really terrible. It was like World War II by MTV.
Yeah, it made me feel like it kind of okay, so no one's going to know this reference because we no longer have access to this movie, but there was a 1944 Hollywood movie about women pilots in World War II, specifically in the Air Force, actually. So it's kind of about the WASP while the WASP were still flying. And anyways, it's called Ladies Courageous. And in the movie, it shows them as these like glamorous women who are going around just like fly girls, having a good time, wrecking government property, whatever. And I felt like in a lot of ways, Red Tails was similar because it was trying to make them all seem like glamorous pilots and wasn't showing the reality of what it's like to actually fly a pursuit aircraft. And I mean, they showed the danger of it, but in a really terrible way. And yeah.
Yeah. I am desperate to have you cast your book here in a little while because I've read some of your stuff ahead of time, and you and I had conversations about like who's in your book and what they do and things like that. And I want to hear like who you think should be in this film. But let's go back to Memphis Belle real quick, so people will be like, "Oh, you didn't talk about the movie." We talked about the movie a little bit. That's okay. I felt like what I felt like watching Memphis Belle. It felt like Young Guns. It felt like they were trying to establish a new Brat Pack for like in 1990. It was like everything was so stereotyped. It's like here's Matthew Modine in the very straight role, and I love Modine, like love Matthew Modine. Like I grew up watching the dude, and he was so cast against type in this film because he's really best when he's, you think about Modine as his real role is, in Full Metal Jacket, like the kind of wisecracking dude, and he's so straight. He was such the straight guy in this. It was almost hard to watch. But going back to watch, is like, is that Sean Astin in the belly of this bomber? It's like the crew was, everybody was here. It was like Lord of the Rings. It was like these. It was like the Fellowship of the. It was like the Fellowship of the Wing.
I feel like this podcast episode is how many puns can Jason fit in?
I feel like, first of all, that's every podcast that I do. So I'm considering a sortie of sorts. Sortie, that's good. All right, let's continue on. So the Memphis Belle was a real crew, correct?
Yeah, and it's a real aircraft too. So because there actually was like another aircraft that completed 25 missions first, but it had like a different crew on it, like throughout its duration of the missions. So yeah, and I mean the crew itself, like you mentioned, the ball turret gunner. I thought they did a good job showing how terrible of a job. I always tell my students that if I had to be in a bombing crew during World War II, that is the job that I would not want, because that's the person that even if things go sort of well and you make it back to base, but something in some way is wrong with the plane and you have to do some sort of forced landing because your landing gear won't come down, that person dies on landing, and that's all there is, so there's just so many bad things that can happen to you. I interviewed a guy, a veteran who was a ball turret gunner. He was a very like short man, even like in his older age, right? Because you had to be small to be in the ball turret. And he was just like, telling me about these experiences, and it was, just like what they talk about in the film, right? Like all the things that could possibly go wrong in there and how dangerous it is and how you feel like claustrophobic and you're stuck in there, but you have like no choice and no control really, I don't know. I also really liked, they showed like how some people get addicted to the adrenaline of combat. And even if they're not like shooting guns, they still like get addicted to it. And the thought of returning home sounds like miserable to them because they get used to that adrenaline hit. And also they don't know how they're gonna, they're so immersed in the culture and, of the military and of their crew that they can't imagine, like, when I go home, no one's gonna understand, right? Like they're not gonna get my life or what I've been through. And so to them, it seems like difficult to even think about going home.
I feel like that's a recurring theme for veterans, at least from what I've seen. At least it's been depicted on screen. I was not a veteran, but guys and women who go overseas into combat have a hard time relating to life back on the home front, and as a result, go back and continually like re-up to go back into what they know, right? And this is not like, so I guess maybe the thing you see this is like, this is not a solely thing that is unique to, say, the American experience in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is maybe a kind of a universal thing for warfare itself. I'm kind of wondering. I got two questions for you, if we can, because this Memphis Belle is a B-17. There are other bombers that get used. I think the B-29, I think, comes out of Wichita, Kansas. I want to say. If I get this wrong, the people in Wichita will murder me because I know they make a whole bunch of them. I'm kind of wondering how this plane compares like to the other bombers that are used during the war, because the 17 kind of comes first, right? Is that correct?
In terms of the order of development, yes. Do I remember all the specific details? No, but I can tell you that as each, because there was the B-29, there's also the B-26. I don't remember which one came out of Wichita. I would have to look that up. It might be the B-29. The B-29 is the unfortunate one that Paul Tibbets flew to drop the first bomb on the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. But in general, like as each of these subsequent bombers was developed, there were all these problems that would happen because it's like World War II is crazy because you go from World War I, where airplanes are barely used, they're not making sort of any strategic impact, to all of a sudden they're incredibly important in like all the ways, right? Like flying fighters, over aircraft carriers in the Pacific, or, bombers on these campaign missions, whatever. And yet we're developing technology at such a rapid rate that when we produce things, it doesn't always go well the first time, right? So for example, like with the B-29, the connection with the WASP is that when it was first developed, there were major engine fires in it. And so it killed a lot of really amazing male test pilots and who were really good at their job. And so there were guys in the Air Force, pilots, who said, yeah, I'm not flying that. They called the B-29 a widowmaker and said, because you're going to die basically if you fly it because these engine fires. Well, they fixed the engine fire problem, and the Air Force is still trying to convince men to fly it. And so they recruit female pilots who are in the WASP to learn how to fly it. They train them, and then they have them fly these demonstrations for men to, prove, because they are tapping into this old stereotype about women drivers, right? That exists for women pilots. And so they're like, come fly to this military base. And then they get out of the plane and men see that it's a woman and they're like, oh, it must be easy to fly. And then all of a sudden morale shifts just because women are flying it. But the B-26 was called a flying prostitute because it was said to not have good support. There were lots of
nice.
Yeah. So I don't in terms of details technologically, I don't have things off the top of my head, but I do have that because I find that fascinating.
I wonder, we see this film taking place over the skies of Germany. Do we know if the bombing experience or the experience for the Air Corps was different in the Pacific theater versus, say, the European theater? Were these guys experiencing different things, say, over the islands, or say over the main homelands of Japan and elsewhere where they were bombing? Were there, because we see we see this, we see in Band of Brothers. That's horrible flak field. The whole Band of Brothers scene is just awful, right? When they're deploying over Germany, or over France. Are these guys going through the same thing in the Pacific theater? Is it a similar thing? Do you know what's going on over there? What's happening?
Yes, so it's different in the sense that when you think about Europe versus the Pacific, in Europe you have England to fly in and out of. So especially so in Memphis Belle, for example, when you see the B-17 flying without pursuit aircraft to support it, there's no fighters around helping, that's because it's not until 1944 that we even have pursuit aircraft that are technologically developed enough to fly that far to protect the bombers.
Wow.
That's actually why. But when you think about it, okay, in the Pacific, where are we going to go off of, right? And so that's a part of the island hopping strategy in the Pacific, is trying to see okay, strategically, we do want to be able to take off and then make it back to the aircraft carrier, right? Because that's an advanced thing that the Japanese were able to do before we were in World War II. And so you have planes that are mostly involved in air battles over, areas that we're having, that we want a base, right, at this island. And so the war will sometimes be won in the literal air because the airspace. And then that is the significance of, using fighters in the Pacific and things like that. So there is air support for ground forces, but it's not the same type of bombing campaign until later in the war. And that's when we start to bomb Japan, right, in Tokyo. And that's actually why we pick the two cities that we do in August 1945 in Japan to drop atomic bombs, is because those haven't been firebombed and strategically bombed during the war. And we want the impact of the full effect of it, basically.
I didn't have a very good understanding of the firebombing campaign until I saw The Fog of War. Did you see this?
I haven't, but I need to.
Devastating. We tend to think about, and of course we've got the new film Oppenheimer, which just came out, which I haven't seen yet. I've been moving, folks. I also want to see Barbie, but I really didn't have a good understanding of the firebombing campaign until I'd seen that. And it was just, we think about those atomic bombs, which are obviously devastating and terrifying and terrible weapons. But oh my God, the firebombing campaign killed so many more people. It was awful when we get down to what human beings can do to one another. I want to shift a little bit because I want to come back to your book, because one of the things I think is just fascinating is the story I'd never even heard of. Before you and I got to talking, I'd never heard of the WASP. I didn't know about women pilots or anything like that. And I really want to kind of come back and start talking about, we see Memphis Belle. We know that we generally know the story of the heroic American and British flying soldiers who were up there, the airmen who were up there. But I want to know about the women who are volunteering to do this work as WASPs. So, if you can, talk to me a little bit about who's volunteering to become a WASP. Like, where are they drawing their ranks from?
Yeah, so they're all over the continental United States. There's basically the very first women pilots to fly for the Air, I'll just call them the Air Force, it's Army Air Force, but to fly for the Air Force, they are actually ones that have been directly recruited from the Air Force. They've gone through the records of who has flying hours, and they were looking for women that literally had thousands of flying hours. And there weren't very many of them. And so those are like, there were originally 28 women who started off, and they're like, okay, these women are successful. Because at first it was an experiment. They were like, it was kind of like the Tuskegee Airmen. We don't know if women are, emotionally or psychologically or intellectually equipped to fly, right? Which is like a whole thing where they question their intelligence levels. They question, when they're on their menstrual cycles, are they going to be able to fly government property, or will they wreck it because they have a mental breakdown in the air, and then there's all this stuff about their bodies. Like, oh, is their like uterus gonna, turn upside down, or are their periods gonna affect their ability to fly? And so the women are required to report it to the doctors at the bases where they're serving. And because they're supposed to be grounded. They're not allowed to fly while they're on their menstrual cycle. But the doctors who are responsible for this, these medical officers, get really frustrated, and they write in these memos, like, official Air Force memos to Air Force officers, and say, can you please like stop making us track this, because very few women are reporting it to us. Most of them are saying, oops, I missed it this month for like the entire, several months I've been here. Or, like it's having no impact on their flight, so please stop making this a thing. And so the Air Force decides, okay, like we don't need to track that anymore. But there is a lot of physical strength required, because they don't have the same, like now when you fly a plane, you don't need physical strength to fly it, right? But back then you did. And so there was this discussion of like, maybe women can fly smaller aircraft, but maybe they can handle military aircraft, because it takes a lot of upper body strength. And we're not sure. Hap Arnold, who's the commanding general of the Air Force, says, like, he gives this speech to them, a graduation speech, where he says, I didn't know if a slip of a young girl could, handle the controls of a bomber plane, basically. And you're just like rolling your eyes at this. Because he literally was like, at the beginning of the war, I didn't know if women were capable physically of handling it. And so when they recruit women, they're like, okay, these women are established pilots, but like, can they fly military planes? We don't know. And then once they can, they're like, okay, well, now we want more women, because we've been sending so many men overseas, and having lots of deaths. And so we're like, let's, fill in the ranks with some women, to just do on the home front, not flying combat, because that was not what we did during World War II. And so they were like, the Air Force is like, okay, well, we'll set a certain number of flying hours, just like we do for male pilots. And the really great thing about this is that FDR in 1939, during the Great Depression, when the war starts in Europe, he actually starts a free, government New Deal program that allows one woman for every 10 men to get free pilot training. So pilot training was really expensive back in the day, just like it is right now. I tried to look it up to get flying hours, and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to be able to afford that. That's fine. But this was a way that like literally hundreds of women were able to get their flying hours, which then allowed them to apply for the WASP program in the first place. Because if that program hadn't existed, we would not have had anywhere near enough women to like sign up for the WASP or even train.
One of the things that always amazes me is when I look at the rosters of these young men in World War II who are fighting in these flying these planes. These kids are 19, 20 years old. Is this the same thing as for women? How old are the women who are signing up to be a WASP?
Yeah, so they had the same age requirement as for male pilots, which was 18 to 35. What was different for women, though, even after World War II, actually, as well, is that if you were a woman and you were 18 to 21, you had to get a parent's permission. They kept this policy for years after World War II as well for women. They had to get their parents' permission, at least one parent's permission, before they could enter the military. But if you're 21 or up, it was okay. So I don't have the average age of the WASP, but most of them were centered in like their early 20s, which would be the same for like the bombing crews. The average age of the soldier and airmen who served during World War II was 26, but that takes into account like the officers and things like that. Typically, like on the crew, the ones who are drafted or the ones in the bombing crew, or for the WASP, it's like 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Some of them are older, but not a lot.
One of the things that interests me is this idea about, first of all, it sounds like none of these generals had ever actually seen or spoken to a woman before, as far as these questions like, can we fly during the menstrual cycle, or can they fly at all? Can their bodies handle it? What happens if their body parts fall out?
Yeah, it's great.
And I'm just smacking my head here. This idea, what I'm interested in is, and you've talked a little bit about this, is the idea of, say, women's sexuality. There's so many presumptions being made about women pilots and women who are serving in this capacity. Can you kind of talk a little bit about like the presumptions that are being made about women, or how women are expressing themselves sexually? What is it like to be a woman in this role?
Yeah, so especially because it's not, for starters, you have women in the military in general. So women in World War II, even if they're performing traditional jobs, which like all the other branches are, you're still facing a lot of backlash, even from family members, communities, the general American public, because the stereotype about women entering the military is that you are inherently in some way, quote unquote, masculine. And if you're not, the military is going to, swing you that way, with gender roles and things like that. And, oh no, women are wearing pants because they have the option of pants or skirts, right, for their uniforms. And so that's a whole issue for American society to deal with. But then for the WASP, you have this added level of they're also performing all this non-traditional work. So there's pilots. So the WASP actually talk about how, as they're ferrying planes across the country, there are all these rules and restrictions placed on them by the Air Force because the Air Force is very concerned about their image and, misconceptions of them. So, for example, there are WASP who talk about ferrying a plane, from a factory to a base. They then, will like stay in a hotel in the town because that base doesn't have any place for women to sleep. So they'll stay in the hotel for the night. And when they're at that hotel in their military uniform, the hotel staff thinks that they're a prostitute and, turns them away. Right. And so there's all these, like, even when they're doing their job in the most straightforward way, there's still these misunderstandings of what women in the military are doing. Like, some people thought women in the military were, quote unquote, servicing men as well. Right. And so you have just all these, things that the women themselves are confronting. For a lot of the WASP, they talk about, yes, that they're confronting these things, but a lot of them talk about, I just wanted to fly planes. And flying civilian aircraft is totally different than flying a really big, fun, a fast pursuit plane or a large bomber. And I wanted to fly at high altitudes, and I just wanted to fly for a living. One woman, I loved it when I interviewed her. She basically, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's in my book. She says something about like, I felt like I was going to die if I had to be a secretary. Like, I couldn't do it. Cause she's like, I went, to my counselor at college and I was told you can be a secretary or a teacher. And she's like, I'd rather die. So she's like, I was so excited by this opportunity because I wanted this as a career,
That gets into a really important discussion that I wanted to have with you. Actually talking about the process of creating this history itself. This was based on this was your dissertation topic. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
How did you envision this project? And then because oral history has become this really important component of your work, which is like my favorite part, is like talking to you. And I've talked to you about this before, about doing these interviews. So it's maybe hoping you could talk to the audience and me about how you envisioned this project originally, how you wrote it into the disc, maybe how it changed afterwards, and your relationships. The thing that fascinates me most is your relationships with these amazing women. If you can kind of talk about that.
I originally learned about the WASP whenever I was in grad. Like I was wanting to get my master's and I was going to be a teacher. And so I was like, I'll do something history related that I think is fun. And so I found this story of them and you could like email a WASP. And I was like, well, that's really cool. I can talk to them directly. And so then long story short, I decide, oh, I want to get my PhD and keep writing about them and write a dissertation. I was like,
That'll be easy.
I know, right? I was like, I need to start interviewing them. And that I was faced with this daunting task, like pretty much everyone else is who wants to interview a group of people. Like, how do I start connecting with this community and how do I find these people? You know, what do I do? Especially like with age, not all of them have email or whatever. And so long story short, the very first like connection I made was so just fascinating. I just loved it. I was on this flight for travel reasons. I wasn't like doing anything for research. And I didn't talk
You
to
were
this
not
guy.
on a bomber or a test run. You're not like a
No,
P-51 as one does.
sadly, no. That would be the dream. They charge a lot of money to ride these planes, and every time I go to air shows, I'm like, ugh, if only. But anyways, so I was on this flight. I did not talk to the guy beside me, but then towards the end of the flight, we just started making small talk before we landed. And lo and behold, he said, "Oh, you researched the WASP?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, you've heard of them?" Because I don't get that very often. And he was like, "Yeah, my grandma's one. She lives in Indiana. You want to research her or interview her?" And I was like, yes." And so, long story short, he set me up with his grandma. So I interviewed her. She was my very first one. And then she told her friends about me, right? So, like all her WASP friends. And so then I would also, since I was in grad school in West Texas, I literally wanted to go to grad school at Texas Tech so that I could be near where the WASP had their reunions. That's how
Oh,
ridiculous
for
it is.
real?
Yeah. I literally went to grad school because I was like, they're 2 hours from where the WASP had their reunions in the middle of nowhere, Sweetwater, Texas. There's no other like, because I was like, how else do I get funding to go to that every year, you know? And so, yeah, so I did that. And then the shirt I'm wearing is actually from one of the WASP reunions. And so I would go to the reunions and then that original WASP, her name is Marty Weil. She's no longer with us, but she was a wonderful lady. She introduced me to all her friends and then they introduced me to their friends. And so I just got to interview WASP because they were just like very kind. Or I would meet like their kids at different things, like at different air shows and things. And they'd be like, "Oh, my mom's like homebound, but you could come like interview her if you want." Or even when I moved to PA, like 8 years ago, there was actually a WASP who was in her late 90s. Shootsy Reynolds. I talk about her in the book in my first chapter in the intro. And she was, I don't remember now, but late 90s when I interviewed her. And I was just like so impressed with her because she had like the stamina of a 20-year-old. And we interviewed for like 8 hours that day. And so she just like told me all her things. But anyways, so talking to all of them allowed me to ask them questions that aren't in the records, right? There's quite a few records that the Air Force has about them. So I had Air Force policies, these medical officers' memos about periods, you know, and all these other things. But I was like, there's other stuff I want to ask them about, like, how did they identify, like, did they see themselves as military? There's a lot of women today who don't identify with the term veteran, even if they're out of the service. And so I was like, I wonder if the WASP did. And so I talked to them about, so basically in the book, I look at the process of these women pilots trying to get military, like veteran status, because they're the only women's unit during World War II that didn't get it. And so yeah, so
Wow.
I traced that story and I talked to them about like, did you identify as a veteran? Like, what did that look like for you? Because I make lots of arguments in the book about why they didn't get military status during the war, but in the end, it came to a congressional bill. Like Congress decided each of the military units, and they voted no for the WASP, but yes to the other ones. So yeah, you have to read the book to find out. This is like a little like teaser thing I can say now, which is really exciting.
No, I'm so excited. Like, it sounds to me, gender is such an important role of this, and it tells us so much more about not only, gender during the war, but these perceptions of gender. It seems like after the war, it's like women couldn't possibly be veterans when clearly they are contributing to the war effort in these really amazing ways.
But the crazy thing is, when you ask like the general public, like, hey, can you name a famous veteran? It's like crickets, right? If you ask, like, can you name a famous, like, they'll often say like a male veteran, but they can't think of a female veteran. Or when they think of the word soldier, they immediately go to like a man in like camo or something, right? Instead of a woman. It's like there's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
still with like, yeah, popular perceptions and ideas.
Yeah, I mean, my immediate thought was like Audie Murphy or maybe John Basilone or someone like that. But there's, and this is the things because knowing about your book, I so want this to be a film. Like this is such a film or a miniseries or something to put these women into context. And I was kind of hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the women who are in this film in this book that would make an awesome movie about. Kind of talk about maybe 2 or 3 women you would see, we might see, because there's some competitive visions amongst these WASPs about what their role should be. I was kind of hoping maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I thought about this for like casting, this book. And I was like, okay, so there were 2 female pilots that directed the program. There was Jackie Cochran
Okay.
and Nancy Love. They were very, very experienced pilots. In my opinion, they should be as popular as Amelia Earhart because they were actually even more successful than her. But no one ever remember them. Like their names are forgotten. And so I was like, we have to have them in there so that people know them and know their characters. Because Jackie Cochran is like a really dramatic individual that you could do like a whole miniseries just on her. And I was trying to think of like who they should be. And so I was like, during the war, these women were in like their 30s, late 30s. And so I was like, okay, we need people in like their late 30s. So I don't know, for Nancy Love, she was very subdued and quiet and dignified. She came from a really wealthy background. She didn't really like the media a lot. So I was like, we need an actress who's not in the media a lot and we don't know a lot about her. And so I picked Natalie Portman because she's very like dignified and seems like, that sort of world. I don't really know a lot about her background, but she also stays out of the media and doesn't seem to like, thrive in doing media interviews or being out there. And so I was like, we need someone like that to be Nancy Love.
Right.
For Jackie Cochran, I was like, we need someone who's a little bit older, someone like her early 40s, maybe like mid 40s, because we don't actually know how old Jackie Cochran was. That's how crazy her background was. She's honestly just as badass as it gets. Constantly, she's very like driven. She just tells it like it is. She would go into a room of men and be like, I'm going to talk to Arnold directly and not go up the chain of command. She was very much like, I'm a girl boss and I'm going to do it, my way, which during the 1940s did not go over well with male officers. Right. So I was trying to think of like stereotypical women who wouldn't go over well with men. And she's a little bit older maybe than her 40s. I think she's in her 50s. But I was thinking of Sandra Bullock.
Oh, yeah, Bullock would be good. I was thinking about her.
Yeah. Do you have any idea? You had your fingers crossed. Did you have an idea otherwise for Cochran?
Yeah. Jessica Chastain.
Okay.
Jessica Chastain, I think, would be really good.
Yes.
But you're casting this film. So, yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about that scene in Zero Dark 30 with Jessica Chastain where she's like telling off her superiors. And I'm like, also, I'm a little bit in love with Jessica Chastain. So if she were in more movies, that would be okay with me. So if we could make this happen through HATM, that'd be fine. No, I think she'd be awesome. But are those the only 2 women that you think would be like good stories around? Or are there anyone else that you think you would cast?
Well, then we need some WASP because they were just like the directors, right? And so I was like, okay, we want WASP. I was like, we want a WASP to represent the fact that there were women of color who flew for the WASP but could pass as white because you were only allowed to be white. Yes. But there were women who were Native American, like Indigenous women. There were women who were Japanese American, actually, Chinese American. And then there were also some women who we think were Mexican American, but it's a little vague. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, what about Jenna Ortega, who plays Wednesday, like in the character? Because she could probably pass as white, right? Like people have had different ideas about, her like race is fluid, right? In terms of the way people like see you. And so I was like, she would be perfect because she would represent the WASP who were women of color, but could still like pass as white potentially, right? In different situations. Mm-hmm. And then I was trying to think of somebody else who like was classically pretty, because there were a lot of WASP who were selected literally because of their appearance, because the women had to do a face-to-face interview and they wanted women who looked good in the media because they're going to have their pictures. So there's this one woman who got photographed for the cover of Life magazine and in 1943 in July, and the media, like literally, like the journalist was like, "You're the prettiest one on the space, like I want you on the cover." So I was like, who would be like the one that everybody said, "Oh, you're the prettiest one," like, and so I picked Emma Roberts because she's like classically
Oh.
pretty, but also would probably be the one that was pulled out to like style, like, this is how you should style your hair. And now we're going to put you on the cover of the magazine. Like, but yet she can still do her job. I don't know. That's where I went with that.
I could see her in the very like 1950s stylish with like the heavy
Mhm.
lipstick and red
Yeah.
nails and the hair and all that kind of stuff. I could see her in the, in that role.
Yeah. 'Cause that's the image that the media uses, right? Is like a white woman who's
Yeah.
like, yeah, has classic features, is very symmetrical. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is such a fascinating story. Here's what I think. Were there losses among the WASPs? Were
Mhm.
there accidents? Did we lose women pilots? And were there cover ups? What happened with that?
We lost 38 women pilots during the war. We lost them either from accidents. The majority of the accidents were not their fault, because there were accident reports for male and female pilots.
Hmm.
But there were accidents from everything from training, which was the same accident rate as that happened to men, towing targets. They didn't actually die from shrapnel, but they died because the planes they were flying were so old and terrible, right? Because you don't want good planes. And so they would have like need to make an emergency landing, but their hatch wouldn't open, right? And they died upon landing. Crazy things like that. And so the 38 women who died, their stories are wild because they were still considered civilian during the war, because they don't get military status until 1977. And so for a lot of them, they did not have a military funeral. None of them got military benefits. They used civilian life insurance. And their families were told not to display a gold star. Some families did anyway. They were told not to have a military burial, but there were some families that did it anyway. But they didn't get those like benefits for the family or anything like that. Oh, and it's,
What a load
same.
of horse shit.
Yeah, it's crazy. There's also one that's still MIA. There is a woman who's still missing. She obviously is killed, but we don't know where. And there have been several teams, like there's this organization, a civilian organization called Project Recover, that my friend Colin Colborn works for, and they're actually trying to find her crash site. It's somewhere in the western United States. She crashed during the war. She had just gotten married like a couple months before. Her name is Gertrude Tompkins Silver, and we have no idea where she is. So it's kind of crazy.
That's awful.
Yeah.
Every last part of the way these women are treated by the federal government is so loaded. And I just said, you were talking, it's like, this is such, in my head, I'm just screaming because I'm like, this is such complete horseshit. The way these women get treated, who are absolute heroes, contributing to the war effort in every last way possible. There's been a change. You said in '77 they got recognition by the federal government. What brings this about? Like, why the change some 30 years later?
The women themselves. So they literally
Really?
organized. They had reunions just like other vets do, and they talked before about maybe trying to get benefits, because a lot of them were like, "We want benefits for the 38 women who died. We don't care about ourselves." And then they were like, that we don't know how to do that, or that's a big effort." And a lot of them were trying to find careers at that time, so they're like, "No." And then in the 1960s, they start to gain momentum, during the era of like civil rights and things like that. And, that all of this is kind of in the air. But then you also have the first women entering the service academies in the 1970s. And a lot of media reports there were the, quote unquote, first female pilots in the Air Force, the Navy, etc. And it says, first American women fly military aircraft. And the WASP are like, excuse me. And so a lot of them are like, okay, we should fight for military status because we've been so forgotten that, like, even in the media, they're not recognizing that there were pilots in World War II. And so they literally campaign and fight for it. There's this one woman who stands in line at a Star Wars premiere when it comes out in California, just getting signatures for a petition for Congress, right? Like, they do all these things to organize, and then they're successful. And then Jimmy Carter signs into law in 1977, and they finally get veterans benefits. So if they want to be, they've had to still fight again, because there was a WASP a couple years ago who wanted to be interned at Arlington National Cemetery. Her name was Elaine Danforth Harmon. I actually interviewed her back in 2012, and she told me back in 2012, I'm so excited because I'm going to be interned at Arlington and, blah, blah. And then I read in the news that Elaine Danforth Harmon's family is like fighting for her, the right for her to be interned at Arlington, because the Secretary of the Army has decided, oh, we're running out of space, so we're going to have to start restricting who comes to Arlington. And so the WASP plus these other groups are no longer allowed. And so her granddaughter, Erin Miller, and her family actually fought and got a bill passed through Congress so that the WASP can now be again interned in Arlington, which is the right they were supposed to have in 1977. It was a whole big thing.
Are there any WASPs left? Are they any still with us?
Yes, none that I personally know, but the museum in Sweetwater, Texas, where the reunions are held every year, they always talk about the fact that, there's still some left and we still talk to their families, but it's not the same like culture of reunions like what I used to go to, right? And it's also like, oh, we invited one WASP to come out this year and things like that. And so I don't know the number, but like based on the age range that they could be during World War II, we're talking late 90s for the youngest of them, if, for the ones that are still alive. So, yeah.
These women are just absolutely amazing. And I just hope people buy this book and read it because, like I told you, I had never heard it. And then, for those listening now, you and I have been friends for a while, but I was like, Sarah, when do we do this pod? When do we do this? I just so wanted to get this story out there, and because it's such an amazing piece. I'm kind of wondering now if we can switch gears just a little bit before we come back to the end of all of this. If you can talk a little bit about maybe the research or maybe some of the books that were maybe kind of talk maybe like 3 books that really influenced your own work when it comes down to yourself as a scholar, or are the things that other people should be reading, obviously other than Sarah Myers? What do you like?
Maybe there's a few others out there.
Maybe.
Yeah. So I really love Kara Dixon Buick's works. She's had a book on called Officer Nurse Woman about Vietnam nurses. She had a book on The Girls Next Door, which is about basically like entertainment for the troops throughout, American history, like, through the ages. And I just love all of her analysis. Like she's written a lot of other stuff, but about her analysis of gender in the military and the roles and images and stereotypes and sexuality and all the things. Tanya Roth also wrote a really good book called Her Cold War that I really liked, about women in the military from like 45 to 80, looking at the integration of women after the Armed Services like Integration Act for women and things like that. And so she looks at the kind of the like drama behind the scenes for women. I also was thinking when you're asking about books that influence me, when you talk about like the experiences of World War II, this might seem a little bit out of left field, but I really like E.B. Sledge's With the Old Breed. It's like a memoir about a man who served in the Pacific. The HBO series, The Pacific, is literally like based around his book. And honestly, like it's one of the most influential books I ever read because he's so deeply self-reflective about the experience of war. And so I think like if you're at all interested in like people's experiences of war, he would be a great starting place because he not only talks about, sort of the identity or culture of the Marines, but he talks about like his own journey through like the ethics of war. When we were talking about like firebombing earlier, right? Like the ethics of what happens on the ground. He very much is going against the whole stereotype of like, this is the greatest generation that could do no wrong. Instead, he's like, we did a lot of wrong and I grappled with it a lot. And then he also goes into like, this is what my experiences with killing even, right? Like how I was able to do this, what I thought, what I experienced, what I went through emotionally, how I got, through to the other side. And it's that kind of stuff that I just really love like analyzing about experiences of war is how everyday people, that's why I tried to incorporate in the book, like the women's voices about like, what is it like to fly these large aircraft. Because even like with Memphis Belle, you do hear the sound of like the engine starting up. You kind of get the sense for the feel of like what it sounds like even when you're in the bomber. And there's just a lot of like sensory experiences that I find fascinating.
I'm wondering now, we talked about your favorite books. What about favorite films? Do you have favorite World War II movies? You kind of talked, you talked about this big list you had created. Memphis Belle was on them. And when I was at Wichita State, home of some of those bombers, with John Dryford, who was my professor, he had us do a course in World War II and film. Do you have favorite films on World War II? What do you got?
Okay, that's a really good question. I have to like think about for a second, because some of the movies that I put on the list, I picked actually not because I thought they were good, but because I thought there'd be a lot of things to say about them. Like a lot of things.
Choose that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, okay, so I'll say first that I also picked ones that I thought were good about like experiences. So before we get to the really bad ones,
Totally.
I liked Hacksaw Ridge for like, experiences and for thinking about, out of the box thinking, basically. I said that in a weird way. But,
sure.
I also picked A League of Their Own because it tells you, right, something you may not know. And I picked Unbroken to try to, again, add another angle of this. I picked Red Tails because I thought it was horrendous. And I wanted them to say that it was horrendous and like why. Because if they got up there and said, because I had them present it too, they had to write a paper. But if they got up there and said it was amazing, then we were going to have problems, I did what else? I did The Imitation Game because it has some problematic. So it's the one that talks about like British intelligence, right? And it has some problematic ways that it handles the sexuality of the character played by, what's his face?
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Benedict Cumberbatch, yes. They have really problematic ways of handling his, like navigating his sexuality and the way they kind of tell the story and the things they emphasize. I like Dunkirk because of the way you feel when you watch the film, right?
Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen The Best Years of Our Lives?
I have, and nobody picked it. I did put it on the list, though.
Oh, my God. It's so... When I took the course, with Dryford, I was expecting to get a Band of Brothers, all this more recent stuff. And most of the films we watched were films in black and white. They're coming out during the war. I think Best Years of Our Lives, I'm dying to do. So maybe you'll come back on and we can talk about Best Years of Our Lives.
That'd be great.
I think it's the most phenomenal film. And Professor Dryford was like 75 when I was taking this class. And he was like, look, Teresa Wright, all I'm going to say. I was like, all right, whatever, man. And I'm like, oh my God, Teresa Wright. I full on, yes, but that's just me. We don't, I've outed myself as a Teresa Wright fan. All right, let's come back to this whole podcast. Memphis Belle. Is it a history movie?
No.
Ooh.
It is. It's experiential because it doesn't get like the details right. They just totally botch all the history and are like, here, let's slap together a bunch of things that happened to a bunch of different crews and pretend like it was just for this one.
Wow, Sarah. So you're saying the Memphis Belle bombed history.
This is how it is. I didn't make the rules.
That's fine. Sarah, where can people find your book?
You can find it on the UNPC Press website, Barnes & Noble, Target, Amazon, and bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is the one that's like local, that has like, you support local bookstores, independent bookstores. So bookshop.org.
And where can people find you on Twitter or X or social media? Where can people find you online? When people want to read your book and tell you how awesome it is.
You can actually find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, the easiest. So LinkedIn, my name, Sarah Myers. But then I'm still calling it Twitter because I'm in denial about the nonsense. But it's at Dr. like Dr. Sarah, Sarah Myers, Myers.
Well, Dr. Sarah Myers, thank you so much for being here on the pod today and talking about your book. And also, we talked about Memphis Belle for like 10 seconds, which was cool. So your book's way better. Like, yeah, Memphis Belle, kind of a stinker, but your book is awesome, and I can't wait for people to read it because these women are amazing. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. This was great.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you guys so much for joining in and listening today. Thank you to our guest, Sarah Myers. You can find her on Twitter at Dr. Sarah Myers. You can find her new book, Earning Their Wings, The WASPs of World War II and the Fight for Veteran Recognition. It's available out as of September 19th. So if you order now, it'll be right out. Check that book out. It's absolutely amazing. I've got a copy of it right here. And thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell. And of course, thank you to everybody for continuing to join in, to listen to this pod, to share it with your friends. Thank you so much. This just doesn't happen without you. You hear me say that every week, but gosh, I sure do mean that. So we've got a lot more great pods coming up for you. Just keep subscribing. And if there are pods that you want to listen to, if there are scholars you want to hear from, please do let me know. In the meantime, y'all be good. Ciao for now.